Every legend has an origin. Before the fame, before the success, and before the world knew their names, they faced failure, rejection, sacrifice, and impossible odds. But what transformed ordinary people into unforgettable legends? Welcome to Legend Origin Studios. Here, we uncover the hidden struggles, defining moments, and extraordinary journeys of the people who changed our world. And for our very first story, we begin with a silent, misunderstood child who would one day reshape humanity's understanding of time, space, and the universe. This is the untold origin of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein. Millions know the name. They recognize the wild, uncombed hair, the iconic mustache, and the playful tongue sticking out at the camera. He is the universal symbol of pure, unadulterated genius, a man whose very name is synonymous with supreme intelligence. But almost nobody knows what happened before the fame. We look at the legend, but we ignore the origins of the mind that reshaped the universe. In fact, the obsession with his genius was so intense that on the day he died in 1955, the pathologist who performed his autopsy literally stole his brain. Dr. Thomas Harvey removed the brain without permission from the family, took it home in a jar of formaldehyde, and kept it hidden for decades, desperately hoping to find the physical secret of his brilliance. Doctor dissected it into 240 blocks, searching for extra neurons, unusual folds, or a secret anatomy that could explain how this man unlocked the secrets of time and space. But the doctor was looking in the wrong place. The secret of his genius wasn't hidden in the physical tissue of his brain. It was forged in the agonizing, silent, and deeply misunderstood years of his childhood. If you were to travel back to Ulm, Germany in March of 1879, you would not find the birth of a celebrated prodigy. Instead, you would find a mother paralyzed by fear. When Pauline gave birth to her son, she took one look at him and panicked. The baby's head was massive, oddly shaped, and strangely angular. Her family whispered anxiously around the crib, convinced the child was deformed. While the swelling eventually went down, the anxieties surrounding the boy were only just beginning. As he grew from an infant to a toddler, a chilling realization settled over the household. Instead of being a chattering toddler, he remained in complete, unsettling silence. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3. The house was devoid of the typical, chaotic noises of a growing toddler. His parents were terrified. In the late 19th century, developmental delays were heavily stigmatized. They secretly consulted doctors, agonizing over the horrifying possibility that their son was mentally deficient. Was his brain broken? Was he incapable of learning? Even when the silence finally broke around the age of 4, his method of communication was bizarre and unnerving to everyone who witnessed it. He would not just speak naturally. Instead, he would form a sentence in his head, softly whisper it to himself, and only then, after testing the words, would he say it aloud. He repeated this exhausting ritual for every single sentence.
The world celebrates his ultimate success, but very few know the crushing price he paid to achieve it. When we picture his life, we imagine a glorious, interrupted ascent from a bright student to a revered, world-changing professor. We assume that a mind so brilliantly engineered for physics would naturally have doors thrown open for it. The reality was a humiliating, agonizing grind of rejection that almost forced him to abandon science entirely. Walking away from his German high school and renouncing his citizenship felt incredibly liberating at first. But the harsh reality of being a 16-year-old dropout quickly caught up with him. Determined to forge his own path and bypass the traditional high school diploma, he set his sights on the prestigious Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. It was one of the few elite universities in Europe that allowed students to take an entrance exam without a formal secondary degree. This was his chance to prove that his mind was perfectly capable, even if he refused to play by the rules of the German military-style schools. He sat for the grueling examinations, supremely confident in his abilities. And he failed. While his scores in mathematics and physics were completely off the charts, his performance in the general subjects, botany, zoology, languages, and politics was abysmal. The university rejected him. It was a staggering blow to his ego. He was forced to swallow his pride, enroll in a standard high school in the small Swiss town of Aarau, and spend a year finishing the diploma he had so arrogantly abandoned. Eventually, he was admitted to the Polytechnic, but his deeply ingrained rebellious nature hadn't vanished. In fact, it had only intensified. He despised the rigid curriculum of the university just as much as he had hated high school. Instead of attending the mandatory lectures, he frequently skipped classes, preferring to sit in local cafes, smoke his pipe, and read the cutting-edge works of pioneering theoretical physicists on his own. He believed his professors were stuck in the past, teaching outdated science, and he wasn't afraid to let them know it. His attitude infuriated the faculty, particularly his physics professor, Heinrich Weber. He was a respected experimentalist, but he found this young student's arrogance absolutely intolerable. Weber once looked at him and said, "You are a smart boy, Einstein, a very smart boy, but you have one great fault. You will never let yourself be told anything." He survived his university years not by his own diligence, but by relying on the meticulous, beautifully written notes of his brilliant classmate and loyal friend, Marcel Grossmann. He also found a fierce intellectual and romantic partner in Mileva Maric, the only woman studying physics in his section. Together, they skipped classes, read forbidden theories, and dreamed of a future where they would revolutionize science side by side. But when graduation finally arrived in the summer of 1900, the consequences of his arrogance came crashing down with terrifying force. As his classmates were smoothly handed academic positions, comfortable futures, and comfortable salaries, he was met with violently slammed doors.
Professor Weber, completely fed up with the young man's insubordination, actively blacklisted him. Weber refused to hire him as an assistant and ensured that no one else in the department would either. Every single student in his graduating class secured a job in academia. Every single one. Except for him. He spent 2 agonizing, desperate years searching for a permanent job. He mailed letters to esteemed professors across Europe, practically begging for a chance to work in their laboratories. "I will soon have graced every physicist from the North Sea to the southern tip of Italy with my offer," he bitterly joked to a friend. The replies were either polite rejections or, more often, complete silence. He was broke, unemployed, and deeply humiliated. To survive, he took temporary, low-paying gigs tutoring high school students and substitute teaching.
He was barely scraping by, eating cheap meals and feeling like a profound disappointment to his family. But the emotional toll of his failure was about to reach a devastating climax. His father, Hermann, whose electrical business had failed yet again, fell severely ill in Italy. In the autumn of 1902, the young physicist rushed to Milan to be at his father's side. Hermann's heart was failing. On his deathbed, the father finally gave his stubborn son the blessing to marry Mileva, a union the family had previously opposed. But the unspoken truth hanging in the air of that hospital room shattered the young man's soul. Hermann died believing that his beloved son was a complete failure. He died thinking his son was a lost wanderer who'd squandered his massive potential, ruined his life by dropping out of school, and alienated everyone who tried to help him. Decades later, the physicist would confess that his father's death was the deepest, most traumatic shock of his entire life. The guilt of letting his father die disappointed in him was a gaping wound that never truly healed. He was 23 years old, grieving, deeply impoverished, and expecting a child with Mileva out of wedlock. He was at the absolute bottom. Science seemed like a closed door, a beautiful dream that he had foolishly ruined with his own pride. Finally, out of sheer desperation, a lifeline appeared. His old friend Marcel Grossman, the same friend whose notes had helped him pass his exams, pleaded with his own father to help the struggling physicist a job. Strings were pulled. A quiet interview was arranged. He didn't get a job in a laboratory. He didn't get a position at a prestigious university. Instead, he was hired as a technical expert third class, a low-level clerk evaluating patent applications in the Swiss patent office in the quiet city of Bern. To the academic world and to his remaining family, this was the ultimate defeat. The rebellious dreamer who wanted to decode the universe had been forced into a tedious, invisible government job. He was expected to sit at a small wooden desk analyzing diagrams of gravel sorters and electromechanical typewriters 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, until he retired. It looked like the end of his scientific ambitions. Little did they know, the absolute isolation of this quiet, unassuming room was exactly what his mind required. The event that changed everything was about to begin.
The patent office in Bern was supposed to be a graveyard for his ambitions. Instead, it became his sanctuary. Far away from the toxic politics of academia, free from the crushing pressure of professors telling him what he was allowed to think, his mind was finally unleashed. He sat at his cramped wooden desk, rapidly analyzing patent applications for electrical synchronizers and gravel sorters. He would finish his required day's work in just a few hours. He then hid his own physics notes in his desk drawer, quickly sliding them out of sight whenever his supervisor walked into the room. The rest of the day was spent staring out the window, watching the clock towers and the trains speeding by, running elaborate, impossibly vivid thought experiments in his head. What would the world look like if you could ride alongside a beam of light? How would time behave if you were moving faster than a speeding train? He wasn't entirely alone in this mental universe. He bounced his radical ideas off his closest confidant at the patent office, an engineer named Michel Besso, and debated fiercely late into the night with his wife Mileva. But the heavy lifting was done entirely inside his own imagination. He had no laboratory, no academic funding, and no team of researchers. He had only a pen, a notepad, and an unshakable conviction that the universe was hiding a monumental secret. Then came the spring of 1905. Over the span of just a few breathtaking months, this unknown 26-year-old patent clerk unleashed a scientific earthquake. He submitted 4 papers to the leading German physics journal. Any single one of these papers would have cemented a scientist's legacy for a lifetime.
In the first, he argued that light was not merely a continuous wave, but was made of tiny, indivisible packets of energy, what we now call photons. In the second, he provided undeniable mathematical proof for the physical existence of atoms, a concept that older scientists still violently debated. In the third, he introduced the special theory of relativity, proposing the radical, terrifying idea that time and space are not fixed but are entirely dependent on how fast you are moving. And finally, almost as an afterthought, he submitted a brief 3-page supplement containing a devastatingly simple equation. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. With 5 symbols, he revealed that mass and energy were exactly the same thing, just in different forms. It was the most miraculous outpouring of pure scientific genius since Isaac Newton. He had taken the ultimate risk, challenging the absolute laws of physics that had governed the world for 200 years. But how did the scientific community respond to this paradigm-shattering revelation? With absolute silence. For months, nothing happened. The world didn't immediately recognize the tectonic shift that had just occurred. He remained at his desk in the patent office, agonizing over whether anyone had even bothered to read his work. Was he destined to remain an invisible clerk forever? But slowly, the greatest minds in Europe began to notice. Max Planck, the undisputed titan of theoretical physics, read the papers and immediately realized the staggering magnitude of what this young man had done. When Planck began lecturing on special relativity in Berlin, the dam broke. Slowly but surely, the academic world realized that a giant was hiding in a Swiss patent office. Invitations began to pour in. He was finally offered a professorship. He began to travel, to debate, to collaborate with the brightest minds of the era. The silent, rejected child was rapidly becoming the rising star of global science. Yet, amidst this rising fame, a massive, dangerous flaw haunted his beautiful theory. Special relativity only worked for objects moving at a constant speed. It didn't account for acceleration, and more importantly, it completely failed to explain the most dominant force in the universe, gravity. Isaac Newton's gravity still ruled the cosmos. To overthrow Newton and explain the true nature of reality, he would have to push his mind past the absolute breaking point. It was a terrifying challenge, one that would cost him his marriage, his health, and nearly his sanity. For 10 grueling years, he waged a brutal war inside his own head. He was no longer fighting the scientific establishment. He was wrestling with the universe itself. He was trying to prove something that sounded like absolute madness to anyone who listened. He proposed that gravity wasn't a magnetic-like force pulling objects together, as Isaac Newton had claimed. Instead, he argued that gravity was a literal warping of the very fabric of space and time. Imagine a heavy bowling ball resting in the center of a trampoline, creating a deep dip that causes smaller marbles to roll toward it. That invisible curve, he hypothesized, was how the cosmos actually worked. The mathematics required to prove this concept were terrifyingly complex. He pushed his mind so far beyond its natural limits that his body began to shut down.
His stomach bled. He collapsed from severe exhaustion, and his personal life completely shattered. He was trading his family for the secrets of the stars. Finally, in 1915, against the bloody backdrop of the First World War, he published the general theory of relativity. But a theory on paper is just a theory until the universe proves it. He boldly claimed that the sun's immense gravity would actually bend the light of distant stars passing behind it. The only possible way to test this insane prediction was to photograph the stars during a total solar eclipse. In 1919, a British astronomer named Arthur Eddington organized an expedition to the coast of West Africa to capture the eclipse. When the photographic plates were developed and the microscopic measurements were calculated, the results were undeniable. The starlight had bent. The calculations were perfect. Overnight, the unknown clerk was no longer just a physicist. He became a god of science. Newspapers around the world printed his name in massive, bold headlines, declaring that the fabric of reality had been rewritten. The public, deeply exhausted and traumatized by the endless horrors of World War I, clung desperately to this brilliant, peaceful man who had somehow decoded the heavens. A prominent Jewish intellectual who openly preached pacifism became a prime target for the rising Nazi Party in Germany. His brilliant theories were suddenly smeared in the press as Jewish physics. His books were thrown into massive public bonfires. Realizing that his life was in imminent danger, he made the agonizing choice to abandon his homeland forever, fleeing across the ocean to the United States and taking refuge at Princeton University. The pacifist who had once famously refused to support the violence of World War I now faced an impossible moral dilemma. In 1939, after learning that German scientists had successfully split the uranium atom, he was persuaded by his terrified colleagues to sign a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. That single signature helped launch the Manhattan Project. When the atomic bombs were ultimately dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he was utterly devastated. Though he had no direct involvement in engineering the weapon, his elegant equation, E equals mc squared, was the foundational principle that made the explosive release of energy possible. The man who had dedicated his entire life to uncovering the profound beauty of nature was forced to watch his life's work unleash unimaginable human destruction. It was a heavy, suffocating burden of guilt he would carry for the rest of his life. He had unlocked the mechanics of the stars, but could he save humanity from destroying itself? And as his final years approached, what was the one ultimate elusive secret he was still desperately trying to uncover in the dark?
When people picture him in his final years, they almost always conjure the exact same image. They see a quirky, grandfatherly eccentric wandering the quiet, leafy streets of Princeton without socks, happily scribbling incomprehensible equations on dusty chalkboards. The world viewed him as a lovable relic, a gentle monument to a past era of science. But what people so often misunderstand is the immense, heartbreaking isolation of his final decades. While the rest of the physics world rushed forward into the bizarre, chaotic realm of quantum mechanics, a field he had literally helped birth, he flatly refused to follow them. Quantum mechanics relied heavily on probability and chance. It suggested that the universe, at its core, was fundamentally random. He famously and stubbornly rejected this, declaring that God does not play dice with the universe.
He spent the last 30 years of his life completely alone in his scientific pursuit, desperately searching for a unified field theory. He wanted one single elegant equation that would tie all the chaotic forces of nature into one beautiful, predictable package. His colleagues whispered behind his back that he was wasting his time, a once great king chasing a phantom in the dark. But he didn't care. He wasn't working for the applause of academia anymore. He was trying to read the mind of God. Yet there is a profound, fiercely courageous aspect of his legacy that is almost entirely erased from our history books. When he arrived in America, he looked around and saw the deep, ugly scars of racial segregation. For a man who had narrowly escaped the horrifying rise of Nazi Germany, the sight of systemic racism in the United States terrified and outraged him. He didn't just stay quiet in his safe, privileged ivory tower. He became a fierce, uncompromising advocate for civil rights. He proudly joined the NAACP. He formed a close friendship with the prominent black activist W.E.B. Du Bois. He broke unwritten, strictly enforced social rules by inviting black opera singer Marian Anderson to stay in his home when local hotels refused her a room. In a time when it was highly dangerous to speak out, he stood before the students of Lincoln College, a historically black college, and openly condemned racism as a disease of white people. The FBI considered him such a radical threat to the status quo that they kept a secret file on him that eventually grew to over 1,400 pages. The man who understood the intricate mechanics of the cosmos also deeply, intimately understood the fragile and often tragic human condition. On April 17, 1955, his body finally gave out. He experienced severe internal bleeding caused by the rupture of an abdominal aortic aneurysm. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors frantically told him that they could perform a surgery to save his life. But the man who had reshaped our understanding of time decided he had run out of it, and he was completely at peace with that.
Lying in his hospital bed, in immense pain, he gently but firmly refused the surgery. "I want to go when I want," he told the doctors. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He passed away the very next morning at the age of 76. When the nurses entered his room to clear his belongings, they found two things resting on the nightstand beside his deathbed. One was a draft of a speech he was writing to promote global peace. The other was 12 pages of tightly written mathematical equations. Right up to his final fading breath, he was still reaching into the dark, searching for that ultimate unifying truth. Albert Einstein was not just a brain in a jar. To view him merely as a human calculator is to miss the entire point of his existence. He was imagination incarnate. He was the silent, misunderstood boy who looked at a pocket compass and dared to ask why the needle moved. He teaches us that failure and rejection are often just the incubation period for brilliance. He proves that questioning authority is not a character flaw, but a moral and intellectual duty. Most importantly, he left us with one final, undeniable truth. Knowledge is strictly limited to all we now know and understand. But imagination embraces the entire world and all there ever will be to know and understand. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more incredible journeys of the world's most fascinating people.